On a warm Saturday afternoon, the kind of day where the sun feels like a soft hug and the air smells faintly of freshly cut grass, things were finally calm. The mayor of a small suburban town was taking a much-needed break from her hectic life. For months, she'd been juggling meetings, community events, and late-night phone calls about everything from potholes to bigger issues like budget cuts. But today was hers. She stepped into her backyard, the one place where she could truly unwind. Her house wasn't flashy or overly big. It was cozy, with flower beds lining the fence and a little wooden bench tucked under a tree. But the crown jewel of her yard was the pool. It wasn't Olympic-sized or anything fancy. It was just perfect for floating around on lazy weekends. She slipped into her swimsuit, grabbed her favorite book, and headed outside. As soon as she settled onto the lounge chair by the water's edge, she felt herself relax. The sound of birds chirping mixed with the gentle ripple of the pool filter. A cool breeze kissed her skin, and for once all the stress seemed far away. This was her happy place, the spot where she could forget about emails, deadlines, and politics. But peace has a funny way of being short-lived sometimes. Next door, her neighbor, a man in his 60s who always seemed to have an opinion about everything, was busy mowing his lawn. He wore a baseball cap and sunglasses, and he moved with the kind of energy that suggested he took great pride in keeping his yard immaculate. Over the years, they hadn't really interacted much beyond polite nods or the occasional "good morning." But today, something caught his eye. Peering over the low fence that separated their properties, he spotted her lounging by the pool. At first glance, it didn't register. Then, as if flipping a switch, his expression changed. His jaw tightened, and his brow furrowed. To him, this didn't look right. In his mind, she didn't belong here. Not in this neighborhood, not in this backyard, and certainly not in that pool. Without giving it another thought, he stormed inside his house. His face flushed with indignation, he picked up the phone and dialed 911. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, but his words were sharp and accusing. "There's someone trespassing at 12 Maple Street," he said firmly. "They're using the pool. I don't know who they are, but they shouldn't be there." The operator asked for details, trying to clarify whether there was any immediate danger. But the caller didn't care about nuance. All he cared about was making sure this woman was dealt with swiftly. He hung up, feeling satisfied that he'd done his civic duty. Little did he know his actions were about to set off a chain reaction that would ripple through the entire neighborhood, and maybe even the country. Back at the pool, the woman remained blissfully unaware of what was coming her way. She flipped a page in her book, savoring the quiet moment. If someone had told her what was about to happen, she probably wouldn't have believed it. After all, why would anyone call the cops on her? She owned this house, paid her taxes, worked tirelessly for the people in her town, and yet none of that mattered to the man next door. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens pierced the peaceful atmosphere. 2 police cars pulled up in front of her house, their lights flashing brightly against the calm blue sky. Officers stepped out looking serious as they approached the gate leading to her backyard. One of them called out asking if anyone was home. That's when she realized something was wrong. Setting her book aside, she stood up slowly, brushing stray droplets of water off her arms. Her heart began to race, not out of fear exactly, but out of confusion. Why were the police here? What could possibly be happening? As she walked toward the gate to greet them, she kept her composure. Years of public service had taught her how to stay calm under pressure. Still, nothing could have prepared her for what came next. One officer asked if she lived there, his tone cautious but professional. She nodded, introducing herself plainly. "Yes, I do. This is my house." Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "And I'm also the mayor of this town." The officers exchanged glances, clearly surprised. Meanwhile, the neighbor hovered nearby, peeking over the fence, expecting chaos. Instead, he found himself facing a situation far more complicated than he'd anticipated. In that moment, the pieces began falling into place, or rather, they started tumbling down like dominoes. What had started as a lazy afternoon by the pool was now spiraling into something no one saw coming. And as the truth unfolded, it would leave everyone involved questioning not only each other but themselves too. The sound of sirens grew louder as 2 police cars rolled to a stop in front of the house. The flashing red and blue lights painted the neighborhood in an eerie glow, turning what had been a quiet Saturday afternoon into something that felt more like a scene from a movie. The mayor stood by her pool, watching as the officers stepped out of their vehicles. They moved with purpose, their boots crunching against the gravel driveway as they approached the gate leading to her backyard. One officer called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" His voice carried across the yard, breaking the calm. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Something about this moment felt surreal, like she'd stepped into someone else's life instead of her own. Still, she knew better than to panic. With years of experience handling high-pressure situations, she walked toward them, her bare feet padding softly on the cool concrete around the pool. "I'm here," she said, raising her hand slightly, so they could see her. Her voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that commanded attention without being aggressive. As the officers reached the gate, one of them glanced at her, then back at his partner. There was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, though he tried to hide it. "Ma'am," he began, "can you confirm if you live here?" His question hung in the air for a moment, heavy with implication. It wasn't just a casual inquiry, it was loaded, layered with unspoken assumptions. She blinked, processing the weight of what he was asking. For most people, answering such a straightforward question wouldn't require much thought, but for her it carried layers of meaning she couldn't ignore. "Yes," she replied evenly, meeting his gaze. "This is my home." Then, after a brief pause, she added, "And I'm also the mayor of this town." Her words landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward. The officers exchanged glances again, this time with visible surprise. One of them shifted uncomfortably, while the other pulled out his radio to verify her identity. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. From the other side of the fence, the neighbor who had made the call watched intently, his face smug and self-assured. He leaned against the wooden slats, arms crossed over, his chest clearly convinced that he'd done the right thing. To him, this whole situation was playing out exactly as he'd expected, the authorities arriving to deal with an intruder. What he hadn't anticipated, however, was the woman standing confidently in her swimsuit, calmly asserting ownership of the property and her position of power. "You see?" he shouted, pointing dramatically at her. "She's lying. She doesn't belong here." His voice rose with indignation, each word dripping with accusation. The officers turned to look at him, their expressions unreadable. One of them raised a hand, signaling for him to stay back. "Sir, please let us handle this," the officer said firmly, though not unkindly. Meanwhile, the mayor kept her focus on the officers. She could feel the absurdity of the situation pressing down on her, the irony of having to prove she belonged in her own backyard. But she didn't let frustration show. Instead, she offered to provide identification or any other proof they might need. "You can check my ID," she suggested, her voice steady. "Or call the city hall. They'll confirm who I am." At this point, the second officer spoke up, his tone softer, but no less professional. "We're just doing our job, ma'am," he explained. "We got a report about a possible trespasser and we have to investigate." He sounded almost apologetic, as if he understood how ridiculous the whole thing seemed. And maybe he did. After all, it wasn't every day you responded to a call only to find yourself face to face with the mayor of your town. As the officers worked to verify her identity, the neighbor grew increasingly agitated. He paced back and forth along the fence, muttering under his breath. Every now and then he'd shout something else, insisting that she was up to no good. "You think I don't know what's going on here?" he barked at one point. "This isn't right. People like her shouldn't be allowed in this neighborhood." His words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. The officers ignored him for the most part, focusing instead on confirming the facts. But the mayor heard every syllable. Each comment stung, not because she cared what he thought of her personally, but because it reminded her of the deeper issues lurking beneath the surface. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was about prejudice, fear, and the assumptions people make based on appearances. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the officers lowered his radio and nodded. "Ma'am, we've confirmed your identity," he said, his tone respectful. "Everything checks out. You are indeed the homeowner." The relief washed over her, though she didn't allow herself to fully relax yet. The situation wasn't resolved, not completely. Turning to the neighbor, the same officer addressed him directly. "Sir, she lives here," he said plainly. "There's no issue. You may want to reconsider making baseless accusations in the future." The man's face reddened instantly, embarrassment mixing with anger. He sputtered, trying to come up with a response, but nothing coherent came out. Instead, he retreated a few steps, glaring at everyone involved before disappearing into his house, slamming the door behind him. For a moment, silence fell over the yard. The officers lingered briefly, offering apologies for the disturbance before heading back to their cars. The mayor watched them go, her mind racing. On the surface, the ordeal was over, but she knew better. This wasn't just about her. It was about the community she served, the values they claimed to uphold, and the work that still needed to be done. As the sirens faded into the distance, she sank back onto her lounge chair, staring at the ripples in the pool. The peaceful afternoon she'd envisioned was long gone, replaced by something far more complicated. And yet, even in the midst of frustration and disbelief, she felt a spark of determination ignite within her. If this incident revealed anything, it was that change was necessary, and she was in a unique position to help make it happen. The moment the police officers left, the backyard felt eerily quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. The rustle of leaves in the breeze, the faint hum of a distant lawnmower, the soft splash of water as a stray leaf floated across the surface of the pool. But for the mayor, the calm was deceptive. Inside, her mind was racing, replaying everything that had just happened. She sat back down on her lounge chair, but it wasn't the same anymore. The peaceful afternoon she'd been enjoying just minutes earlier now felt like a distant memory. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers tapping absent-mindedly, as she stared at the fence separating her yard from her neighbor's. She could still picture him standing there, arms crossed, face red with indignation, shouting accusations like they were weapons. His words echoed in her head. People like her shouldn't be allowed. Those words stung more than she wanted to admit. Not because she cared about his opinion, he was after all just one man, but because they represented something bigger. Something ugly and pervasive. It wasn't just him, it was the assumptions, the biases, the way people judged others based on skin color or stereotypes instead of facts. And while she'd faced prejudice before, this time it hit differently. This time it happened in her own home. Before she could let herself spiral too far into thought, she heard movement on the other side of the fence. Sure enough, the neighbor reappeared, though he looked less confident now. His earlier bravado had dimmed, replaced by a mix of embarrassment and frustration. He leaned against the fence again, glaring at her as if daring her to say something. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was thick, almost visible, like a fog rolling in. Finally, she broke the silence. "You know," she said, her voice calm but firm, "this is my house. I bought it fair and square. I pay my taxes, I take care of my property, and I work hard for this community." She paused, letting her words sink in. "So why does it bother you so much? To see me here?" Her question hung in the air, sharp and pointed. He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. When he finally spoke, his tone was defensive. "It's not about that," he muttered, though his body language betrayed him. His arms were stiff, his jaw clenched tight. I didn't think someone like you lived here." "Someone like me?" she repeated, raising an eyebrow. Her voice remained steady, but there was an edge to it now, an undercurrent of challenge. "What does that even mean? Someone black? Someone successful, someone who doesn't fit into whatever box you've built in your head? He flinched at her words, but only slightly. Instead of backing down, he doubled down. Look, I'm not saying it's wrong or anything, he said quickly, though his tone suggested otherwise. But this is a nice neighborhood. People expect certain things. They want to feel safe, comfortable. You can't blame me for looking out for my community. She sighed, shaking her head. Safe and comfortable, she echoed softly, almost to herself. Then louder. Let me ask you something. Do you really think calling the cops on me made anyone safer? Or did it just make things worse? For everyone? For the first time since the confrontation began, he faltered. His shoulders slumped a little and his gaze dropped to the ground. Maybe he realized how hollow his argument sounded, or maybe he was starting to see the cracks in his own logic. Either way, he didn't have an answer. By now, the commotion had drawn attention from other neighbors. A few curious faces peeked out of windows or appeared over fences. Some stood awkwardly in their driveways, pretending to check their mail or water their plants while secretly watching the drama unfold. Others weren't so subtle. They gathered closer, whispering among themselves. One woman approached cautiously, holding a glass of lemonade. Is everything okay? She asked, glancing between the mayor and the neighbor. Her tone was hesitant, unsure whether she should intervene or stay out of it. It's fine, the mayor replied, offering a small smile. Just a misunderstanding. She didn't elaborate, and the woman nodded uncertainly before retreating back to her yard. But the whispers continued. News traveled fast in neighborhoods like this, especially when something unusual happened. Within minutes, snippets of the story were spreading like wildfire. Some accurate, some exaggerated, all fueled by curiosity and speculation. As the crowd grew, so did the tension. The neighbor seemed to shrink under the weight of the attention, his earlier confidence crumbling. He mumbled something about needing to get back inside and disappeared into his house once again, leaving the mayor alone with her thoughts and the growing audience of onlookers. At first, she considered retreating, indoors herself. After all, she'd already dealt with enough for one day. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the realization that this moment mattered, that it wasn't just about her or her neighbor, but about the entire community. If she walked away, now what message would that send? That these kinds of incidents were acceptable? That people could spout hateful rhetoric and face no consequences? No. She couldn't let it end like that. Standing up slowly, she turned to face the small group of neighbors who had gathered. Most of them looked uneasy, unsure how to react. Some avoided her gaze altogether, while others offered tentative smiles or nods. Taking a deep breath, she addressed them directly. I know today has been unexpected, she began, choosing her words carefully. And I'll be honest, it hasn't been easy. Being accused of trespassing in my own home isn't something anyone should have to deal with. But what concerns me more is the mindset behind it. The idea that someone can look at another person and decide they don't belong, not because of anything they've done, but because of how they look or where they come from. Her voice softened, becoming more conversational. We live in a diverse world. Our differences are what make us stronger, richer, better. But those differences also scare some people, and when fear takes over, it leads to moments like this, moments that divide us instead of bringing us together. She paused, scanning the faces around her. Some people nodded in agreement, while others looked thoughtful. A few still seemed uncomfortable, shifting their weight from foot to foot. But no one walked away. I'm not here to point fingers or assign blame, she continued. What I am here to do is remind us all of something important. This neighborhood belongs to everyone who lives here. Every single one of us. And if we want it to be a place where people feel safe, respected, and valued, then we need to start acting like it. Her words resonated, cutting through the awkwardness and uncertainty. Slowly, the mood shifted. Neighbors exchanged glances, nodding at each other. One man stepped forward, clearing his throat. You're right, he said, simply. "This shouldn't have happened. We're sorry." Others chimed in, murmuring apologies or expressions of support. Not everyone spoke up, but the sentiment was clear. This incident had sparked something, a conversation, a reckoning, a chance to reflect on what kind of community they wanted to be. As the crowd began to disperse, the mayor returned to her lounge chair, feeling drained but oddly hopeful. The afternoon hadn't gone as planned, but perhaps it had served a greater purpose. Change rarely came easily, but it often started with moments like this, moments that forced people to confront uncomfortable truths and choose which side of history they wanted to stand on. By the time the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, the story of what had happened was already spreading like wildfire. News traveled fast in small towns, especially when something as dramatic as this unfolded. People who hadn't even been outside during the incident were suddenly buzzing about it, texting friends, posting on social media, and speculating endlessly. It wasn't long before someone snapped a photo of the mayor standing by her pool, surrounded by neighbors, and uploaded it online with a caption, "Racist neighbor calls cops on mayor relaxing at her own pool." Within hours, the image went viral. Local news outlets picked up the story, turning it into headlines that dominated TV screens and websites. Poolgate, as some clever commenter dubbed it, became the talk of not just the town but the entire country. People couldn't get enough of the absurdity of it all. A respected public official being accused of trespassing in her own backyard, simply because of the color of her skin. The irony was too much to ignore. As videos surfaced, some showing snippets of the confrontation between the mayor and her neighbor, others capturing the growing crowd of neighbors, the outrage grew louder. Social media platforms lit up with reactions. Some people expressed shock and disbelief, while others shared their own experiences of facing similar prejudice. Hashtags like "This is her home" and "No room for racism" started trending, drawing attention to the deeper issues at play. But it wasn't just online where the conversation took off. Back in the neighborhood, things felt different almost immediately. The next morning, as residents stepped out for their usual routines, they noticed an unusual energy in the air. Cars slowed down as drivers craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the house at 12 Maple Street. Kids playing in driveways whispered to each other about what had happened. Even the mail carrier lingered a little longer than usual, pretending to sort envelopes while sneaking peeks at the mayor's yard. Wasn't just curiosity driving the attention, it was guilt, shame, and a growing sense of accountability. Many neighbors who had initially stayed silent or watched from afar now found themselves questioning their own roles in the community. Had they ever made assumptions based on appearances? Had they turned a blind eye to subtle acts of discrimination? These questions gnawed at them, pushing some to take action. A group of concerned residents organized a small gathering later that evening, a kind of informal town hall meeting right in the cul-de-sac where everything had unfolded. Folding chairs were set up on lawns and string lights were hung between trees to create a warm, inviting atmosphere. The goal was simple: to come together, talk openly, and figure out how to move forward as a community. The mayor attended, though. She didn't plan to speak much. She wanted to listen, to hear what others had to say without dominating the conversation. As people trickled in carrying plates of cookies or bottles of lemonade, the mood was tentative but hopeful. Neighbors greeted each other warmly, though there was an underlying tension that no one could quite shake. When the discussion began, it started slowly. One woman raised her hand hesitantly and admitted that she'd seen the neighbor make derogatory comments in the past but hadn't said anything because she didn't want to cause trouble. "I regret staying quiet," she confessed, her voice trembling. "If I'd spoken up sooner, maybe none of this would have happened." Others nodded in agreement, sharing their own regrets. A man spoke about how he'd once overheard a racial slur at a community barbecue and laughed it off instead of calling it out. "I told myself it wasn't my business," he said. "But it is my business. We're all responsible for making this place better." The mayor listened intently, her expression thoughtful. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't lecture or scold. Instead, she thanked everyone for showing up and being willing to have difficult conversations. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said gently. And it doesn't start with grand gestures, it starts with small steps, like admitting when we've been wrong, like standing up for someone when they need it most, like choosing kindness over fear. Her words resonated deeply, prompting more people to open up. A teenage girl stood up and talked about feeling out of place in school because of her ethnicity. An elderly man recounted being followed around a store by security guards decades ago. Each story added another layer to the collective understanding of what prejudice looked like and how it affected real lives. As the night wore on, the tone shifted from somber reflection to cautious optimism. Ideas began flowing freely. Someone suggested starting a diversity committee to organize events and workshops focused on inclusion. Another proposed hosting regular neighborhood potlucks to bring people together and foster connections. By the end of the meeting, there was a tangible sense of momentum, a shared commitment to doing better. Not everyone agreed on every idea, of course. Some neighbors remained skeptical, worried that these efforts might stir up more conflict than they resolved. But even those voices were welcomed, because the point wasn't to silence dissent, it was to create space for honest dialogue. Meanwhile, the neighbor at the center of the controversy found himself increasingly isolated. After the initial confrontation, he had retreated into his home, avoiding eye contact with anyone who passed by. But as the days went on, the pressure mounted. Reporters camped outside his house, knocking on his door and asking for interviews. Online comment sections filled with vitriol directed at him, accusing him of ignorance and hatred. Friends and acquaintances distanced themselves, embarrassed to be associated with him. Desperate to salvage his reputation, he eventually agreed to sit down with a local journalist. In the interview, he tried to defend his actions, insisting that he hadn't meant any harm. "I was just looking out for the neighborhood," he said, his voice tinged with defensiveness. "You can't blame me for wanting to keep things safe." But his explanation fell flat. Viewers saw through the thinly veiled excuses, and the backlash only intensified. Clips of his interview spread online, sparking even more outrage. Memes mocking his behavior popped up everywhere, further humiliating him. Within days, his employer, a company that prided itself on promoting inclusivity, released a statement announcing his termination. "We cannot tolerate behavior that contradicts our values," the statement read. Effective immediately, he is no longer employed by our organization. With his job gone and his reputation in shambles, the neighbor quietly packed up his belongings and moved out of the neighborhood. No one knew exactly where he went, and few cared to ask. His departure left a void, but it also opened the door for healing. For many residents, it served as a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked prejudice, and a call to ensure that such attitudes wouldn't take root again. Back at 12 Maple Street, life slowly returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after such an extraordinary event. The mayor continued her routine, spending time by the pool and tending to her garden. But she also threw herself into the work of creating change, collaborating with local leaders to implement anti-discrimination initiatives and educational programs. Progress was slow, messy, and imperfect. But it was progress nonetheless, and as the weeks turned into months, something remarkable began to happen. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves started waving hello and stopping for chats. Children played freely across yards, their laughter echoing through the streets. Block parties became a regular occurrence, bringing people together in ways they hadn't imagined possible. Though scars from the incident lingered, so did hope. The neighborhood hadn't become perfect overnight, but it had taken a step in the right direction, a step toward understanding, empathy, and unity. And for the mayor, that was enough. Because sometimes the hardest battles lead to the most meaningful victories. The fallout from the incident didn't just stop at the neighbor's resignation and departure. It rippled outward, touching every corner of the community. For weeks, people couldn't stop talking about it. Conversations that had once been whispered behind closed doors were now out in the open, raw and unfiltered. Grocery store aisles became impromptu forums where strangers shared their thoughts on racism, privilege, and what it meant to truly belong. Parents found themselves fielding questions from their kids. Why would someone call the police on a person who lives in their own house? It was uncomfortable, Messy and often awkward, but it was necessary. The mayor knew this momentum couldn't be wasted. If anything, it was an opportunity, a chance to channel the anger, frustration, and confusion into something constructive. So, she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. First, she called a series of town hall meetings, inviting not just residents, but also experts on racial equity, social justice, and community building. These weren't your typical bureaucratic gatherings filled with jargon and empty promises. They were heartfelt, honest discussions designed to make people think and act. At one meeting, a local teacher stood up and shared how her students had reacted to the news. "They're confused," she said, clutching a notebook tightly. "They see this woman, this leader, who works so hard for our town, and then they hear about someone treating her like she doesn't belong. It makes them question whether they'll ever really fit in here, too." Her voice cracked slightly as she added, "We owe it to them to do better." Another speaker, a retired firefighter, talked about growing up in a time when discrimination wasn't just accepted, it was expected. "But we've come so far since then," he said, his weathered face softening. "And yet moments like this remind us that we still have miles to go. Let's not waste this moment. Let's use it to push forward." These stories struck a chord with everyone in attendance. People nodded along, some wiping away tears, others scribbling notes furiously. The mayor listened intently, jotting down ideas herself. She realized that while policies mattered, they wouldn't mean much unless hearts and minds changed first. That's why she pushed for initiatives that went beyond surface-level fixes. One of the first steps was creating a diversity task force made up of volunteers from the neighborhood. Their job: to identify areas where bias might creep into daily life, whether it was in hiring practices, school curriculums, or even casual interactions, and suggest ways to address them. The group met weekly, brainstorming everything from hosting cultural festivals to organizing workshops on unconscious bias. At first, turnout was modest, but word spread quickly. Soon, people from neighboring towns were joining in, eager to learn and contribute. The mayor also teamed up with local schools to develop programs aimed at teaching kids about empathy and inclusion from an early age. One initiative involved storytelling, sessions where elders from diverse backgrounds came to classrooms to share their experiences. Students listened wide-eyed as they heard tales of resilience, struggle, and triumph. Afterward, they wrote letters to the storytellers, thanking them for opening their eyes to new perspectives. "I never knew life could be so hard for some people," one boy wrote. "Now I want to help make things fair." Meanwhile, businesses in the area began stepping up too. A popular cafe started hosting community coffee hours, inviting residents to sit together and discuss tough topics over lattes and pastries. The owner painted a mural on the side of the building with the words, "Together we grow." It quickly became a symbol of the neighborhood's renewed commitment to unity. Not everyone was on board, of course. Some folks grumbled about the sudden focus on race and inclusion, claiming it was unnecessary or divisive. "Why are we stirring the pot?" one man muttered during a town meeting. "Can't we just move on?" But instead of shutting him down, the mayor encouraged dialogue. "Moving on without addressing the root causes won't solve anything," she replied calmly. "Ignoring problems doesn't make them disappear, it only lets them fester." Her approach worked. Slowly but surely, skeptics began to soften. They saw the passion and dedication of those working toward change and realized that this wasn't about blame or guilt. It was about growth. Even the skeptics started attending events, albeit reluctantly at first. Over time, many admitted that they'd learned more than they expected, and that learning felt good. As these efforts gained traction, the media took notice again. But this time the coverage was overwhelmingly positive. Journalists highlighted the neighborhood's transformation, calling it a model for other communities facing similar challenges. National outlets featured segments on the diversity task force, the school programs, and the grassroots movements sprouting up across the town. The mayor herself appeared on several talk shows, speaking passionately about the importance of accountability and compassion. But perhaps the most powerful shift happened quietly, in everyday moments. Neighbors who had once exchanged polite nods now stopped to chat about their weekends. Kids who used to stick to their own cliques at the park started playing together, laughing and sharing snacks. Block parties, which had always been well attended, grew bigger and livelier, with music blasting and tables groaning under the weight of homemade dishes. There was a sense of warmth in the air, a feeling that people genuinely cared about each other. Of course, progress wasn't perfect. Old habits die hard, and there were still moments of tension. A few newcomers resisted participating in the new initiatives, muttering under their breath about political correctness. And occasionally, old prejudices reared their ugly heads, reminding everyone that change is rarely linear. But the difference now was that people were equipped to handle those moments. Instead of ignoring them or brushing them aside, they confronted them head-on with courage, patience, and understanding. Through it all, the mayor remained a steady presence. She attended every event, listened to every concern, and celebrated every victory, no matter how small. She understood that leadership wasn't about standing above others. It was about standing alongside them, rolling up your sleeves, and getting your hands dirty. And though she often joked that she'd never expected her backyard pool to become the catalyst for such sweeping change, she was grateful for it. By the end of the year, the neighborhood looked different, not just physically, with its murals and banners promoting unity, but emotionally, people smiled more. They greeted each other warmly. They checked in on neighbors they barely knew before. It was as if the entire community had taken a collective deep breath and exhaled, letting go of years of unspoken tension. For the mayor, the journey wasn't over. In fact, she knew it would never truly end. Change was ongoing, requiring constant effort and vigilance. But she also knew that the foundation had been laid. The seeds of understanding and empathy had been planted, and with care they would continue to grow. Late one evening, as she sat by her pool watching fireflies dance in the fading light, she reflected on everything that had happened. The memory of that tense afternoon still lingered, but it no longer weighed her down. Instead, it fueled her determination to keep pushing forward, for herself, for her community, and for future generations. Because in the end, this wasn't just her story, it was theirs. Months had passed since that chaotic Saturday afternoon, but the memory of it lingered, not just for the mayor, but for everyone in the neighborhood. Life had settled into a new rhythm, one marked by small yet meaningful changes. The fences between yards no longer felt like barriers. They were starting to feel more like shared boundaries, connecting people rather than dividing them. Conversations flowed easily now, filled with warmth and understanding instead of guarded politeness. And the pool at 12 Maple Street? It wasn't just a backyard feature anymore. It had become a symbol of resilience, justice, and hope. The mayor stood behind a podium on a crisp autumn morning, addressing a room packed with attendees at a national conference on racial equity. Her voice carried confidence, though she spoke softly, almost as if she were sharing a story with old friends. "What happened to me wasn't unique," she began, her eyes scanning the crowd. "It's something many people face every single day. The difference is that my position gave me a platform, a chance to turn a personal moment of injustice into an opportunity for collective growth." She paused, letting her words sink in. Then she continued, "But let me be clear. This isn't about me. My story is just one thread in a much larger tapestry. What truly matters is what we do next. How do we take moments like these and use them to build bridges instead of walls?" As she spoke, images flashed on a screen behind her. Photos from the neighborhood gatherings, kids laughing during storytelling sessions, volunteers painting murals together. Each picture told its own story, showing how far the community had come since that fateful day. But the mayor didn't sugarcoat things. She acknowledged the challenges too. The resistance, the awkward conversations, the occasional setbacks. "Change is messy," she admitted. "It's uncomfortable, but it's also worth it." Her speech struck a chord with the audience. People nodded along, some scribbling notes while others wiped away tears. When she finished, the room erupted into applause, not because she'd offered easy solutions, but because she'd reminded everyone of the power of persistence, Afterward, dozens of attendees lined up to speak with her, asking for advice on how to spark similar transformations in their own communities. She listened patiently, offering encouragement and practical tips, always steering the focus back to action over words. Back home, the neighborhood buzzed with pride. Residents watched clips of her speech online, feeling a sense of ownership over the progress they'd helped create. One woman posted a comment beneath a video of the talk. "This is our mayor, but this is also our story. We did this together." The sentiment resonated deeply, sparking even more engagement. People who hadn't been involved before reached out, wanting to join committees or volunteer for upcoming projects. The momentum kept building, fueled by a shared belief that real change was possible. Of course, not everything was perfect. There were still moments when old biases crept in, subtle and insidious. A new family moved into the neighborhood, and a few neighbors whispered questions about why they chose this particular street. At first, the comments seemed harmless enough, but the mayor noticed them quickly. Instead of ignoring them, she invited the family over for dinner, making sure to introduce them around and include them in community events. It was a small gesture, but it sent a powerful message. Everyone belonged here. Over time, those whispers faded. The new family became part of the fabric of the neighborhood, just like anyone else. Their kids played soccer with the other children, and their mom joined the local gardening club. These tiny acts of inclusion mattered. They showed that belonging wasn't something you earned. It was something you were granted simply by existing. The mayor herself returned to her routines, finding joy in the little moments again. She spent lazy Sunday afternoons by the pool, reading books she'd been meaning to get to for months. Sometimes neighbors would stop by unannounced, bringing plates of cookies or cups of tea. They'd sit together, chatting about nothing in particular, savoring the simplicity of human connection. Those visits reminded her of how far they'd all come and how much farther they could go. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across her yard, she sat on the edge of the pool, letting her feet dangle in the cool water. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and the faint hum of cicadas filled the air. For a moment she allowed herself to reflect, not just on what had happened, but on what it meant. That afternoon by the pool had been a turning point, not just for her, but for the entire community. It had exposed cracks in the foundation of their relationships, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths. But it had also revealed strength, the kind that comes from facing adversity head-on and choosing to grow stronger because of it. She thought about the neighbor who had called the police, wondering where he was now and whether he'd learned anything from the experience. She hoped he had. Not for his sake necessarily, but for the sake of whatever community he found himself in next. Everyone deserved a second chance, even if they didn't always deserve forgiveness. Mostly, though, she thought about the future, about the kids growing up in this neighborhood, learning to see differences as strengths rather than threats, about the parents teaching their children to stand up for what's right even when it's hard, about the endless possibilities that lay ahead if people continued to work together. When the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, she climbed out of the pool and wrapped herself in a towel. As she walked inside, she glanced back at the yard one last time. The pool shimmered under the moonlight, peaceful and inviting. It was hers, yes, but it was also so much more than that. It was a reminder of where they'd been and how far they'd come, and it was a promise of where they could go next. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. There would be bumps and detours, moments of doubt and frustration. But she believed in the power of people to rise above fear, to choose love over hate, and to build something better, not just for themselves, but for generations to come. Because in the end, that's what it meant to belong. To truly belong.